All right, recording in progress. Thanks, Wilson. Anh nhập cho geek Jeremy Jones nhập được action trước sanh một cầm hút the action Mani si sapenta kmani ma vama chi ta pa journey ta pa work ki journey ta chop matam vai ki tam hivi ki Wilson man thơ so yam bumnyo pam jadi ta pero man tan ho mo bonax eta ma pa kak linguistic research just mas ma pojo eta linguistic research ma thơ ke to hai chi imam chapam jadi ka nyo. So I'm very, very happy to be here with you guys. As Wilson said, I am a former NAMA student, and I'm originally from the Akshan Indian community there in Arizona. So I was born and raised in Arizona, just a little bit south of Phoenix. My heritage language is O'odham, and so the majority of the research that I do is on O'odham. Recently, I have engaged in some, I guess, formal/informal research on European Portuguese with a colleague of mine here at Yale. So I am kind of expanding a little bit outwards, and it's interesting to see how some of these dynamics that we look at in terms of linguistic research shift and change a little bit between indigenous languages that have historically been oppressed or minoritized, and languages like European languages, for example, English, European Portuguese, that have not had that same sort of coercion, I guess, social coercion. So what I want to do is to share my screen with you guys, and let's see if I can, I guess this will work. Share, can you guys see that? Yes. Okay, cool, yeah, perfect. So the talk today is called Filtering Linguistic Research and Theory Through an Indigenous Epistemological Lens. And this is an expanded version of a talk that I gave last year at a conference looking at how this type of research or how this type of filtering of linguistic research applies specifically to the type of research that I do. So the majority of the work that I do is in phonology and phonetics, a little bit of semantics as well. And as you're working through the linguistics field, you'll often notice that some of your goals as Indigenous community members are going to be at odds with the goals of what linguistics requires or expects of us in terms of the type of research that we do. So just to give you a quick overview, I'm going to go into a brief introduction explaining how this framework came about. I want to talk a little bit about the field of linguistics in terms of revitalization efforts, a little bit about the linguistics and speech community interface and how this interface changes when the linguistic researcher is somebody from the community. And then we'll get into these community-focused linguistic research framework is what I'm terming it here. There are 4 aspects of this framework. I originally named these all in O'odham, and in O'odham, they're basically questions. But in English, I tried to find a very succinct label for each of these 4 things that gets at the heart of what I want to do with these parts of the framework. And then a brief conclusion, just recapping everything that we're talking about here. I kind of imagine this as a very sort of informal talk. So if you guys have questions at any point, just feel free to interrupt me. I am very happy to discuss this. I'd love to hear you guys' feedback and any questions that you guys have as well as linguists yourself. Let's get into an introduction. Let's see, why do we even need a new framework, right? We're constantly learning about linguistic frameworks. We're constantly learning about new ways of approaching things and doing things. And so why did I even want to add to this deluge of different frameworks and ideologies? So this really stemmed from some of the research that I was doing at the time, which was really couched in generativist linguistic research. So Yale is very, very heavy in terms of generativist linguistic research, and it can be a good thing. I find it personally interesting myself, but I also find it sometimes problematic when it comes to researching and studying Indigenous languages. So at the time, what I was working on was something to help understand better how O'odham speakers do something called reduplication. So if you are not familiar with the O'odham language, O'odham is pretty well known for reduplicative morphology that we have. Whenever we want to make something plural, for example, there are many, many instantiations of what reduplication can do in O'odham, but one of the more common one is pluralizing nouns. And we don't really understand very well how we do this. We know that we're reduplicating things, but we don't know how much we're reduplicating sometimes. We don't know where the reduplicant is going. And so at the time when I was researching this, I was looking at how can I get an answer, right? And so my research was couched within optimality theory. And it was sort of like, I'm thinking we can explain reduplicative morphology if we use this OT framework, right? And the reason why I wanted to explain this is because I also teach autumn at the Autumn Community College there in Arizona. For them, I should say, it's remote since I'm still here in Connecticut. And one of the questions that I guess asked every single semester is, how do I know why Gox becomes Gogox, but Mistor doesn't become Mimistor, for example? And in previous semesters, I would just say, I can't really answer that. That's just how you say it, right? So just internalize it, just memorize it. But it's something that would keep coming up. And so I identified it as a possible topic that I could look at to get an answer. And so I started to focus on various aspects of reduplicative morphology. It's extremely complex, so I had to narrow it down just a little bit and focus specifically on when we have instances of diphthongs in the word. And this research led me into this direction of proposing things like light and heavy diphthongs, which were also proposed for other dialects of O'odham. Mizuki Miyashita, who was a PhD student there at U of A, her dissertation focused on this, was pretty revolutionary in terms of O'odham grammar. And my idea was, well, we can say that the reduplicant is a CV and there's these constraints on the grammar, and it can either be prefixation or infixation. And I came up with all these tableaux. And then in the middle of all this research, I started to realize I've kind of gotten away from what it was that I started to look at this for, right? What I really wanted to do was to come up with an answer for O'odham learners. And if I were to give them this paper at the time, it would have been completely useless to them. They would not have been able to understand or rationalize, because linguists, as you guys know, we like to make things much more complicated than they need to be. And so using things like Tableau and talking about things like constraints on the grammar and prefixation, infixation, light and heavy diphthongs, those are things that are not necessarily needed if your goal is to learn a language, right? And so I started to think, well, okay, I have this work that I'm doing, but how do I make sure that this work is informed by and guided by what it is that my community wants, or what it is that people who are learning this language as their heritage language want? And that's really how this framework came about. So usually when we're studying things from a linguistic perspective, one of the questions that you guys have probably been asked, and I have undoubtedly every single time I identify something that I want to study in terms of the language, the one thing that I always get asked is, what does this tell us about human language in general, right? If you're going to be studying reduplication, what does that tell us about language with a capital L? Right now, I'm looking at definite reference and bare noun phrases, a semantic aspect of all the constructions. And the question I always get asked is, what does this tell us about human language in general in terms of how humans derive meaning? And those are interesting questions. Yeah, somebody's audio is on. Sorry. We good? Okay. Those are interesting questions to ask. But I think they also do a disservice to Indigenous communities. When we are asking, what does this tell us about language in general? Yes, this can help us further our understanding of language and in terms of human language. But it also disregards a lot about what the community perspective would be. And so from a community perspective, my questions then became, if I'm studying reduplication, or if I'm studying bare noun phrases, what does this tell us about our specific language? Not necessarily language in general, but our language, given especially that Indigenous languages are extremely underrepresented, extremely underdocumented, and there is very little often written about our languages. There's a lot that we don't know about our languages. So how does this help tell us anything about our language specifically? And if we are going to take up this research, then how does this help us? If I am researching reduplication or bare noun phrases, then what's the point of that at the very end? How can I apply that in the community? Another question that this really gets at the heart at is, how does this affect epistemological views of language? So what I mean by this is, when I was doing the reduplication study, I would talk to fluent speakers and I would get a number of different answers from them, right? And the idea that only linguists can theorize about language, I think, is a pretty big disservice to Indigenous communities, because Indigenous communities already have our own epistemologies. We already have our own axiologies and ontologies, our own ways of looking at the world and theorizing. And when we import these sort of ideas, for example, optimality theory or generativist linguistic theories, what does that do to Indigenous thought? How does it affect it? How might it change it? And then another question to ask is, how are we represented in this work? So if you take in linguistic classes, which you guys are in one right now, you'll note that sometimes when we're looking at things like phonology, or when we're looking at things like syntax, we see these examples of languages in isolation as sort of data sets. And they aren't really representative of the communities that they come from, right? So we can look at them and try to solve the puzzle of whatever it is that they're asking. But at the end of the day, what we forget sometimes is that there are actually people out there who spoke these words for us to be able to get them on the page. There are actually people out there who use the words that we have on the page in their day-to-day lives. And when we look at them as specifically data sets, it sort of sterilizes that. And the community doesn't become represented in those. And so that's another aspect of what I want to look at with this framework, essentially. So I want to talk a little bit about linguistics in revitalization efforts specifically. Okay, so one of the things that we want to ask ourselves when we're talking about linguistic research is, why do we even engage in linguistic research, right? What is the purpose of the field of linguistics? And this is a really tall order, and there are going to be many, many different answers. But one answer when I was doing the research for this that really stuck out was this idea of the Holy Grail, right? And so what the Holy Grail would be is essentially getting at a characterization of human language by predicting linguistic data characteristic of a speaker of language with a capital L, right? So human language in general. And essentially what we're doing is we're studying these patterns of language, and we're comparing them typologically, and we're trying to find out what are the boundaries and what are the confines of human language. What can human language do? What can't it do? And why can it and can it not do any of those things that we're looking at? So we're trying to approach this in the form of humans have this thing that we don't really understand, which is language. And we're trying to figure out from a generativist point of view how that functions, right? So in many of my classes, you'll hear people say things like, if you're studying something about Chinese, Mandarin Chinese, that should be able to tell you something about Swahili, which in turn should be able to tell you something about English, which in turn should be able to tell you something about Nahuatl, because the idea is that humans are all equally endowed with the same, let's characterize it as maybe a computer, right? And all of us have the same computer, and we're all programmed with the same software. And so languages all have to conform to whatever software is programmed in this computer. And we're trying to figure out what that programming is, because we don't really know what it is yet. That takes a very, very abstract, very, very sterile, very, very scientific approach to what language is and how we're studying it. And this type of research and this type of approach, it can help us, can help tell us something about human language in terms of humans as a whole, the human species. What is it that characterizes human language? I would also argue, though, that the inclusion of indigenous languages in this study can also help us further our understanding of human language in general. And what I mean by that is, currently a lot of what we know about language is very much based in Eurocentric ideas of what language is. So if you've ever taken a semantics course, right now, like I said, I'm doing some research in semantics. And when I was going through the semantics classes, I started to realize I'm really just learning a lot about English. I'm really just learning a lot about what English does. And there was really no diversity in terms of the semantics of human language as a whole outside of English, right? And so we have this world full of languages, and we want to say that we're studying things typologically, which is great. You want to see how things interact cross-linguistically. But the majority of the data that we have comes from a very smaller subset of the languages. And that smaller subset of the languages is very much Eurocentrically based. We know a whole lot about European languages, but Indigenous languages tend to be outside of that purview. We don't know a whole lot about these languages. So when we're coming to these generalizations about what we think language is and how we think language behaves, it's very much based on the typological data that we have, which happens to correspond to largely European languages. And the danger in that is that when we start to make these generalizations, we start to expect languages that are outside of that set of languages to conform to those ideologies and to have to fit within what those generalizations are based on the data set that we have. So this is also a very purely sterile approach, right? So in determining structure of languages. And in very many generativist approaches, what we're doing is we are excluding the social aspect of language use. Now, language fundamentally is it has a social use, right? We aren't just computers that are sort of conveying messages binarily, zeros and ones and stuff. We're interacting with other humans, and there's much more than this sort of sterile determining of the structures of language. So when we exclude the social aspect of language, we're also doing things like excluding issues related to language rights and language determinism and intellectual property. And then we also have to ask ourselves, what is the epistemological and axiological and ontological lens that we're viewing this work through? Is this an indigenous way of knowing that we're looking at when we're looking at specific linguistic phenomena in our respective languages? So before I move on to linguistics and speech community interface, I just really want to check in really quickly. Does anybody have any comments maybe or questions that you guys want to throw out there? This also give me a chance to drink some coffee. You guys are good so far?
Yep.
Okay, cool. All right. So the last section really talks about what is the goal of linguistics? And what is it that we're doing when we're trying to revitalize languages using what we now know as the field of linguistics? And in this section, what I really want to talk about is linguistic-speech community interface. Now, this section gets at the types of issues that you tend to encounter when linguists enter communities, speech communities. All right, so historically, this would happen from a very non-community member / community member relationship, where the linguist was generally a non-community member coming into a space where the language is spoken, and the person that they were working with or persons that they were working with were community members and not linguists. And inherently, this type of relationship imposes a type of social imbalance, right? So linguists may, historically and sometimes maybe even currently, expect that Indigenous knowledge be available to them. And we often see this in earlier works. Those of you who are very much entrenched in linguistics know that linguistics started as a subfield of anthropology. And so there are a number of works out there that look at the anthropological, cultural, social structures of Indigenous communities in terms of customs as well as language. And what would usually happen is you would have these researchers coming into these communities expecting that their informants would provide them with this information. They would collect it and then go back to the halls of academia and use that information to further their careers. And this is what Del Himes refers to as extractive linguistics. You're going to a community to extract information, cultural information, intellectual property without any sort of reciprocity there. And when this social imbalance is imposed on the community, then the community member may feel that they're not in a position to deny these requests for knowledge, and it becomes very exploitative. And usually these results were very Eurocentrically focused assessments of Indigenous knowledge, right? That often characterized Indigenous thought and ideas and customs and language as primitive. So one example that I can think of clearly is in the early 1900s, there was an ethnographer named Frank Russell who did some work on the Akimot, and he wrote a book called The Pima Indians. And almost every reference to things that the O'odham were doing were considered to be primitive because they were being compared to what he thought was proper in terms of Western civilization. I was also recently talking to a colleague of mine who works on Aboriginal Australian languages, And he mentioned a monograph that was written in the early 1900s that linked ergativity usage in Aboriginal languages as indicative of Aboriginal people's inability to recognize their own self-agency. And so these things tend to be very, very Eurocentrically based. They tended to be very, very Eurocentrically based. And a lot of racist and prejudiced assumptions would be made in these publications, right? Now, currently, there's this idea that Indigenous knowledge needs to be fitted to scientific inquiry. So usually what you see is you will get, or sometimes what you will see, and I'll say that this isn't ubiquitous, but sometimes what you'll see is you'll get researchers, linguistic researchers who are not community members interested in some aspect of a particular language. They already know what they want to know about that language, and they go into the community and try to form relationships with the community members so that they can work with them to further study this thing. And then after that happens, the community interests are what are brought in as a sort of afterthought, right? So let's say you want to know something about algorithm reduplication, you go into an algorithm community, you start doing this work, and then afterwards you sort of think, okay, well, I did this work, how am I gonna give it back to the community? Now, it's a good thing to give back to the community in whatever capacity, but this can also be problematic because this isn't necessarily, the research that's being conducted isn't necessarily guided by the community. The community is helping do this research, but maybe not necessarily on something that the community feels might be of immediate need or of immediate interest to them, but more so what the linguist feels needs to be studied at that point. And so this research is usually centered in a space where work is performed in non-Indigenous epistemological frameworks, which are later adapted to Indigenous speech community efforts. So then we have to ask ourselves, where are we anchoring this work? Let's say we want to start some linguistic research. What playing field, what plane are we anchoring this work on? Now, when we have an us-them dichotomy where us would be the Indigenous people and them would be the linguists, the non-community member linguists, usually what you see is that these are two separate entities. The linguists and the speech community are not the same, and their research interests either clash or overlap, but they're usually performed in some sort of symbiotic relationship. And sometimes the goals or the outcomes exist on parallel planes, right? So taking the reduplicative example, if I were a non-community linguist, my goal would be to understand something about reduplication, whereas the community's goal may be to want some sort of pedagogical material, right? These would not be the exact same goals or motivations. They'd be on separate planes. But what happens when the community member is the linguist? Then this us-them dichotomy completely collapses, right? So the researcher and the community member manifest as a single unified body. And the goals and the outcomes of the research shift from parallel planes to a single realm where linguist and community motivation are the same. You guys may have encountered this in your academic careers. I have encountered this so many times with non-Indigenous linguists who will often encourage me to study things that I am interested in and not necessarily study things that my community is interested in. Because for some reason, non-Indigenous linguists are they cannot fathom any world wherein I and my community are the exact same entity. What my community is interested in is what I'm interested in, and what I'm interested in is what my community is interested in, because we are the same, right? So it's not necessary. I've had to defend myself a number of times to say I am studying something that I'm interested in, and it's not necessarily that I'm being coerced into it. So when the community member becomes the linguist, this sort of underlies what I would refer to as all-autumnhood, right? In all-autumn, we would call this all-autumn, and this is just anything that is all-autumn. And what I mean by that is there's this sense of communalism. Traditionally, for all-autumn people, the idea that the community or the group takes precedence over the individual is very much ingrained, even in young all-autumn today. And so when communalism takes preference, then this research is anchored within community-led interests, right? It's not necessarily that some non-community member researcher is identifying some sort of topic of interest for them and then adapting it to the community's needs later on. It's the community is identifying what it needs at a single point in time to further that research on. And so this singularity feeds into the proposed framework here. The linguistic work originates from and is informed by and influenced by a community-based point of reference. So this is most useful for people, linguists, who are actual community members themselves. That's not to say that if you are not a community member and you are not an Indigenous person that you have no use for this, but where this differs from a lot of the ethical considerations that we're seeing in linguistics today is a lot of the time we're talking about how linguists as non-community members can forge relationships with communities or with community members, and what types of considerations can be taken into account there. What I'm concerned with here is how community members who are linguists can further linguistic research already. So you're already entrenched in the community because you are a community member. Now you're also a researcher. How do you proceed with those types of things? And so we're going to go into the framework that I've proposed here and in my paper. I'm going to give a little schematic here of what the framework looked like. So there are 4 major parts, and within the center of the framework is the community. The community is the main driver of the framework. The community is the main stakeholder of the framework, and all research originates specifically from the community itself. There are 4 parts to it on the outside, and we're going to go through it in sort of a counterclockwise motion, but it's not as if this is a checklist. You have to go from 1 to 4. Each of these things, you'll notice I have bidirectional arrows here that suggest that they all work in tandem with each other. So it's not that we have to go from one to the next, but these are things that should be taken into account at all times as you're going through some sort of linguistic research. So the one that I want to start with first would be applicability. And what do I mean by applicability? In all of them, the way that I wrote this was, which literally means, what are we studying this for? What's the purpose of this, right? So often when linguistic phenomena are identified for study, there's a sort of quid pro quo negotiation. And this is what happens when you have non-member linguists working with community members. But when the researcher and the community member are the same, then the point of departure for research is recentered to the speech community itself. And this shift in provenance and motivation of the research allows research to evolve based on that which is most important to a community. So the community gets to assess and evaluate what its needs are. And based on that, they get to say, this is what we think is most important to study at this point in time. And within language attrition, when we recenter like this can help us battle or reverse language decline. So the community defines a question that will have immediate applicability to revitalization and maintenance efforts. And so when communities face decline like this, they've often realized that they might need to understand something about their languages on a more profound level. Profound understanding of underlying linguistic phenomenon can translate to pedagogical settings in cultivating the same understanding in learners. So a lot of what we talk about in terms of what we're studying in linguistics is what we term as tacit knowledge. And cultivating that type of understanding of why speakers do what they do in learners helps to create learners who will be able to manipulate these structures to create new meaning later on. So when they're given these tools, they can understand this more profoundly and be able to become more competent speakers of their languages, however we want to define competency. So given the all-outward duplication example, this was something that, like I said, we often asked students to memorize. This is a facet of the language that you just need to memorize yourself, but that's not necessarily what speakers do. Speakers at some point internalize as part of their grammar how and when they can reduplicate something. And so when we pinpoint the general processes of reduplication, this allows broader application to forms that the learner can reduplicate even if they've never seen this word before. The second part of this framework would be accessibility, right? And so this literally translates is how are we going to use this? So if we've identified a question, then what's the next step? The next step is to investigate this question. So linguistic frameworks can help provide insights to the inner workings of language, but it's also important to remember that these tools and theories can and should be expanded to include Indigenous knowledge that challenges and reshapes them. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later as well. It's also important to remember that these tools can be very inaccessible. So linguistics as a science is taught and studied in such an esoteric way that it's unusable or unintelligible to non-linguists. So if the research is destined for community-based language efforts, then this research has to be accessible in pedagogical environments, right? If we're defining something that we want to know about our language and we want to use this in practical applications, then we need to be able to restructure it in such a way that somebody who has not gotten a degree in linguistics can understand. Because if we don't, then this impacts the educators and the students. And when it impacts educators and students in communities whose languages are facing decline, that's a huge deal, because the educators and students are the ones who are trying to bring it back. If they don't have the tools that they need, then what is the point of this research? So again, with the algorithm duplication example, I framed this with an optimality theory, and I thought OT could help analyze the language, but this actually requires an extra step, right? An extra step of learning how to use tools like OT, one that I had to take months of classes for to learn, and I'm still not an expert. So it's not going to be something that is necessarily practical for the community. We also want to talk about transferability, right? So there's I propose an innate responsibility on the linguist to make work accessible to the community. So if linguistic tools and methods are to be used, they need to be used in a way that they're understandable, and to transfer to accessible formats involves using research as a reference point, informing pedagogical approaches. One thing I really want to make clear here, though, is we also need to remember that I'm sort of walking a fine line here between community member and linguist. I'm not necessarily proposing that all linguistic theory is innately bad or inherently bad, but I am also proposing that theory is just that, right? We don't call them, we call them theoretical frameworks. We don't call them factual frameworks, because theory is still something that's not entirely been proven as fact, right? So in fact, it's fallible in many respects. And we want to make sure that we're looking at this in a way that we're identifying aspects that don't necessarily line up with indigenous ways of thought and knowledge. So the use of these tools also implies Eurocentrically based ideologies, even in scientific fields like linguistics. And this is where indigenous ways of knowing would sort of enter into the frame. I'm going to give you guys a quote here that I really, really love. And this was written by Doris Payne in 1992 in a chapter on free word order. So if you've studied OAuthm, you may know that OAuthm is very, very famous as being a non-configurational language, and also lacking morphological marking to determine who the subject, who the object, and stuff is. So basically, we can scramble words around, and there's some sort of aspect of the grammar that lets us understand who we're talking about and what we're talking about at a given point in time. And this is really revolutionary in the sense that what Payne was arguing for was that, well, maybe all of them, and languages like all of them that don't have a fixed word order, don't have an underlying word order, right? And when you study syntax, that's sort of sacrilegious, right? There always has to be an underlying word order, and things always have to move around. And so what Payne was saying was maybe that's not what it is. And so in this paper, she says, if the first linguists had been all-Authom speakers, and if they were predisposed to assume that all reasonable languages operate on the basis of the same function structure mapping as does their native language, then English would be viewed as a free word order language. So what does this mean? This means, like, when we're confronted with a linguistic phenomenon that challenges current theory, it may be viewed as anormal or an exception to the rule. So Payne's comment really implies that some theoretical frameworks still assume a linguistic normality. And how is this defined? Oftentimes, this is defined by Eurocentric standards of what language is. So that which goes against the grain goes against Eurocentrically derived ideas of language structure, and thus against typological normalcy. And this imposes something that Gill refers to as a straitjacket. We're imposing a sense of expected or unexpected in terms of human grammar referenced against one's native language. And oftentimes this is referenced against the languages that we do know about, which are largely European languages, imposing this sort of Eurocentric view of human language as a whole. The third thing that I want to talk about here is visibility. All right, so dochtaptip literally means who worked on it. And visibility is concerned with the provenance of language that we're discussing. So as I said before, language is often treated as a data set. And when it's treated that way, it becomes sterile and it starts to lack voice. and it's seen primarily for linguistic value without regard to the people who actually speak the language. But in actuality, data sets come from real people who live their lives in these languages, experiencing the full range of human emotion through these languages. And these experiences can also be overshadowed by diglossic effects for historically oppressed languages who have to navigate between their heritage language and some imposed colonial language based on ideas of prestige. So when I do my work, when I'm laying out examples, what I'm doing is I'm essentially invoking the voices of my community. And it's not this abstract idea in terms of what community is. These are my family members, my grandma, my friends, my mom's friends, people that I grew up with, people that babysat me when I was a kid. That's who I am referencing in these papers that I'm writing. And what they've done is to give me a gift of their speech. And so it needs to be treated that way. And in purely scientific analysis, though, this is really often overlooked. So for example, in linguistic spaces, you may also impose colonial ideas on languages. One example that I often see in terms of the study of all of them is this idea that Akimar all of them and Thon all of them are separate languages. I do not support that idea myself. But overtly acknowledging visibility in this sense is really key to maintaining connection between language and study. So what we're doing here is we're saying linguistics tends to view our language in a certain way, and we're not okay with it. What we want to do is we want to devise ways where we can be more visible in terms of who we are, who our languages are, and where they come from. And one way that I did this in the paper that I wrote for this for was to include actual wordage in there that talks about this. So briefly, I will run through this. I know we're getting to the mark where I need to be finished. What I wrote here was the language represented here is the intellectual property and cultural patrimony of the O'odham people. Rather than proposing a framework of separate but related and mutually intelligible languages, I, as a researcher of Thona O'odham and Akimara O'odham descent, recognize all of them in this work as a single unifying language connecting all of them from throughout traditional all of them lands. All language samples herein are representative of all of them speakers who use this language to negotiate their daily lives and experiences. And while I focus on all of them as spoken in Akchin, I acknowledge varying dialects and grammars from throughout the all of them geographic continuum that we are fortunate to still have with us. The language examples that I furnish for Akchin all of them are the product of the Akchin all of them community and the speakers from whom I have learned, with whom I have become accustomed to hearing and speaking all of them, and who as a whole and single entity deserve recognition as the progenitors, keepers, and promulgators of our ancestral language. I put forth an analysis here of our O'odham for the consideration of O'odham language keepers and linguists founded in respect for O'odham ways of knowing as a factor in language study and research. Now this, for a lot of us, would be a no-brainer. This is just something that we would always think and we would want to put in our papers. But a lot of times in linguistics, you're going to come across people who may say things like, that's not central to your argument, and so I think maybe you should take it out. So including these types of things is really important for us in terms of visibility to make sure that when we are doing these types of research in our language, we're making sure that our communities, our family, our friends are being represented in the work that we're doing. Lastly, I want to talk about indigenization. So I literally this is translated as indigenization, but in all of them, this means how are we going to make this thing all of them like? So this references the epistemological filter. And this is the lens that the research is going to be proposed through and the form that it's going to take once it emerges. So when we approach aspects of research from Westernized frameworks, the research emerges solely as connected to the theories of those frameworks. But when we apply Indigenous epistemological filters, this considers how research impacts the speech community beyond applicability. So much of linguistic focus, our research focuses on what we call tacit knowledge, right? So this was sort of promoted by Chomsky as this grammatical knowledge held by native speakers that is difficult to articulate on an abstract level. Okay, great. And linguists can capture and theorize about this knowledge in scientific ways, but it's also a severe underestimation to assume that non-linguist speakers of Indigenous languages have no ability to do this, or that when they do this, it's relegated to what we might call folk linguistics, right? Or not actual scientific linguistics. So indigenous approaches to language ideology greatly inform how speakers view language through an indigenous lens or filter. Many times I have sat with fluent speakers who have said, I think that this word comes from this, or I noticed that these two words sound the same, and they will start to theorize about language. And that's exactly what linguists do, right? The fact that it's not a linguist or it's somebody who does not have a degree in linguistics doesn't make it less valid. And oftentimes when they're theorizing, it's coming from a place of cultural knowledge. They're also weaving in ideas of where do we come from as a people? Where did we get this language? How do we classify things in our environment to help us understand why certain words may behave the way they do? So this filter should be applied to research at each stage. And here I'm implicitly choosing the word indigenization over decolonization as a term. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with the idea of decolonization or the goals of decolonization, but for the purposes of this framework, there's also very many definitions for decolonization. And one of the definitions that stuck out was this sort of idea of decolonization manifesting as rearticulation of power and change in knowledge, right? So we're decentering the frame of work from a colonial structure and reimagining as informed by indigenous epistemologies. Whereas what I'm taking to be indigenization is the inclusion of indigenous epistemologies at every level and phase of research, such that what emerges is not only informed by such epistemologies, but directly represented of them. So we can take an example like deconstructing a house and reconstructing another building using the things that we use to deconstruct that house. That would be sort of like decolonization, whereas indigenization in this aspect would be creating something from the bottom up without having to reconstruct something else. And what we recreate from the bottom up is based entirely in our own indigenous ways of knowing. So in practice, this research takes into consideration the cultural, historical, and social impact of language study. What does it mean for our languages to be studied in such a way? How do people in our communities feel about the study of our languages in these ways? And in what ways might our views and beliefs be affected, altered, or enhanced by such study? When we're doing this linguistic research, it does have the ability to change the way people think about themselves and their languages, which can be a dangerous thing if we're not careful about how we're doing that. So a possible outcome of language revitalization is this explicit grammatical study of one's heritage language. The majority of my students at TOCC are heritage learners. And so what they're doing in reclaiming their language is also learning about how the language works. So indigenization of research is really essential in moderating non-indigenous epistemologies and centering the research in a culturally relevant space. This is also something that challenges current linguistic archetypes of indigenous languages and inherent colonialism present in them. So indigenous languages, it's been proposed that indigenous languages have become conceptualized according to underlying racial and colonial themes upon which the field of linguistics is built. So indigenization of linguistic research will undoubtedly confront, challenge, and clash with Western theoretical conceptualizations. If non-indigenous conceptualizations of indigenous languages are met with indigenous epistemology on a leveled playing field, how will these fare? What I mean by that is if you are an academic linguist from a westernized academic space and you are an indigenous academic linguist from an indigenous space, and you both propose something in relation to language, now that we're leveling the playing field here, which one is going to win out? How will each of those two ideologies or frameworks be influenced or maybe changed by one another? Right now, the way it is that social implication implies that academic ideologies hold precedence over indigenous ideologies in theory. So this indigenization includes the perspectives and input of community-based stakeholders. Essentially, it gives voice and agency to indigenous researchers and a space where indigenous beliefs, customs, and cultural connections are not relegated to folk science. So brief conclusion here. I've basically proposed a framework that situates indigenous epistemologies as a starting point of linguistic research. The four aspects that we talked about were applicability, accessibility, visibility, and indigenization. So this framework essentially challenges ideas of neutralization of linguistic study and inquiry when the neutral territory is in fact couched within colonial structures and legacy. And the crux of this framework is to attempt reconciliation of linguistic research and Indigenous epistemologies, such that the research from inception to completion is entirely informed by Indigenous ways of knowledge. And through doing so, I believe that this type of language study and research can more aptly fit the needs of speech communities as the ultimate stewards and conservators of Indigenous languages. And those are my references. I think I went a little bit over time. I'm so sorry, Wilson.
No, that's fine.
But I'm happy to take comments, questions, have a discussion if any of you guys want to jump in at any point.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.